The sky over the last human city was not blue anymore. It was silver, covered by a shape so large that it blocked out the sun and cast the streets below into a permanent, cold shadow. Mara Ellison stood in the central square with her hands loosely at her sides, watching that shadow grow as the ship descended lower and lower, until the hum of its engines rattled the windows of every building around her. She was the only one standing. Behind her, thousands of people knelt on the cracked pavement, heads bowed, some crying quietly, some simply staring at the ground, because they could not bear to look up anymore. Soldiers who had fought for 11 months, who had lost friends and family, and every battle that mattered, now knelt with their weapons stacked in neat, useless piles at their feet. It was the end. Everyone in that square believed it. Everyone except Mara. She did not kneel because kneeling had never once helped anyone she loved. Her older brother had knelt in front of a checkpoint during the first invasion wave, and it had not saved him. Her commanding officer had knelt in the final days of the siege at the coast, and it had not saved him either. Mara Ellison had decided, somewhere in the long, sleepless months of this war, that if she was going to lose everything, she would at least lose it standing up. The ship's landing ramp opened with a hiss of pressurized air, and a wave of pale blue light spilled out onto the square. Figures began to walk down the ramp in perfect, unhurried rows. They were the Sovereignty's honor guard, tall and thin, wrapped in armor that shimmered faintly like the surface of an oil slick. Their faces were narrow, their eyes large and black, and they moved with the kind of confidence that only came from a species that had never once been forced to lose. At the center of the procession walked a figure taller than the rest, dressed not in armor, but in a flowing robe the color of a bruised sky, stitched with threads that seemed to catch light and pull it inward instead of reflecting it. This was Voth Kalis, Emperor of the Sovereignty, ruler of 11 worlds, and the man who had personally ordered the destruction of 3 of Earth's largest cities in the opening days of the war, simply to demonstrate that resistance was pointless. He did not usually attend surrenders in person. He found them boring, but Earth had fought longer than any of the other worlds his empire had conquered, and he had grown curious about the species that refused to understand when it was beaten. He wanted to see their faces when they finally gave up. Instead, he saw one face that had not given up at all. Voth's escort stopped a few meters from Mara, and for a long moment the Emperor simply looked at her, tilting his head slightly, the way a person might look at an insect doing something unexpected. Cameras hovered silently around them, small metallic spheres broadcasting the moment to both Earth's remaining networks and to every screen across the Sovereignty's 11 worlds. Billions of eyes, human and alien, were watching this exact moment unfold. "You," Voth said. His voice carried through a translation device fixed at his throat, smooth and almost gentle, the way someone might speak to a child. "Everyone else understands what is happening here. Why do you not kneel?" Mara kept her eyes on him and said nothing. A murmur ran through the honor guard. One of the officers standing near Voth, a broad-shouldered commander named Thren, took a step forward with his hand resting on the hilt of a weapon at his side, clearly ready to make an example of her right there in the square. Voth raised one hand, and Thren stopped instantly, obedient as a trained animal. "No," Voth said. "Do not touch her. This one is interesting." He walked closer, his robe trailing across the broken pavement, and stopped only a few feet away from Mara, close enough that she could see her own reflection in his large, dark eyes. "You must be very brave," he continued, "or very stupid. On my worlds, we do not always know the difference, until it is too late for the person to matter anymore." Still, Mara said nothing. She had learned, over 11 months of war, that silence sometimes said more than words ever could. Voth turned slightly to address the crowd, his voice rising now, carrying easily across the square and through the cameras to every screen watching. "Look at her," he said, gesturing toward Mara with an open hand. "One soldier, no weapon, no army behind her, no ship in the sky to save her. And still she thinks her posture matters. This is the tragedy of your species. You mistake stubbornness for strength. You call it courage, when it is only the refusal to accept a fact that is already decided." He turned back to Mara, and for the first time, something like real amusement crossed his sharp features. "Your empire is finished," he said, his voice softening into something almost kind, almost pitying. "Your fleets are gone. Your cities are ash. And yet here you stand, as if standing changes anything at all. A few of the honor guard laughed, a strange clicking sound that echoed oddly through the square. Somewhere behind Mara, she heard a few kneeling soldiers weep harder, humiliated on her behalf, afraid that her defiance would bring punishment down on all of them. Voth studied her a moment longer, waiting for her to break, waiting for the fear to show in her eyes the way it always did, on every world he had ever conquered. It never failed. Sooner or later, every species looked at him the same way, with the same wide, desperate eyes, right before they gave in completely. Mara's eyes did not change at all. Interesting, Voth murmured again, mostly to himself. He turned to Thren. Do not kill her. Killing her makes her a symbol. Instead, keep her close. Let her stand beside me during the formal surrender broadcast. Let every human watching see that even their most stubborn soldier belongs to me now. That will teach this planet far more than her death ever could. Thren bowed his head and gestured for 2 guards to take hold of Mara's arms. She did not resist as they guided her forward, closer to the Emperor, closer to the gleaming ship behind him, close enough now that she could feel the faint vibration of its engines through the ground beneath her boots. What Voth did not know, what none of the Sovereignty's officers standing in that square could possibly have known, was that Mara Ellison was not simply a soldier who happened to be too stubborn to kneel. For the last 4 months of the war, while human cities burned and human fleets were destroyed one by one, Mara had been part of a small, quiet team, operating far from the front lines. Their job had nothing to do with fighting battles that could not be won. Their job was to watch, to listen, to learn everything they could about how the Sovereignty's ships actually worked, how their fleets communicated, how their command systems were built, and most importantly, where those systems might have a weakness no one had thought to look for. It had been slow, careful, unglamorous work, done in the dark corners of a war that was already being lost in every headline and every broadcast. Most of humanity never knew that team existed. Most of the soldiers kneeling in that square had never heard Mara's real title. They only knew her as the sergeant who did not smile much and who always seemed to be thinking about something far away. She had come to this square today, not because she expected to survive the surrender ceremony. She had come because her team's final piece of research, gathered at enormous cost, told her something the Sovereignty had never imagined a human being could discover. And now, standing close enough to Voth Kalis to feel the heat radiating from his ship's engines, close enough to see the intricate patterns woven into his officer's armor, she understood that she was standing in exactly the place she needed to be. The guards positioned her a few steps behind the Emperor, near a cluster of Sovereignty officers whose armor carried small devices fixed to their shoulders, devices that glowed faintly with the same pale blue light as the ship's ramp. Mara recognized those devices immediately, though she kept her face perfectly calm, perfectly blank, giving nothing away. Voth turned back to the cameras, straightening his robe, preparing to deliver the words that would formally declare Earth's surrender to his empire and to every world watching across the galaxy. He looked, for a brief moment, directly into the nearest hovering camera, and a small, satisfied smile crossed his narrow face. "People of Earth," he began, his voice carried by translation devices into 1,000 different languages simultaneously. "Today marks the end of your resistance. You have fought longer than any world before you, and for that, I will grant you this much respect. Your surrender will be remembered as brave, even if it was, in the end, unavoidable." Behind him, unnoticed, unremarkable, one soldier who had refused to kneel stood perfectly still, watching the glowing devices on the officer's shoulders, and slowly, carefully, without moving her hands in any way that might draw attention, she began to reach toward the small, hidden device sewn into the lining of her uniform. The Emperor continued speaking, the cameras continued broadcasting, and on a small screen deep inside Mara's uniform, a single light blinked once, then steadied, waiting for her command. Nobody in that square, human or alien, had any idea that the next few minutes were about to change everything they believed about who truly held power that day. 4 months before that morning in the square, Mara Ellison had been sitting in the back of a broken-down transport truck, driving through the ruins of a city that no longer had a name anyone bothered to use. The war had already taken so much by then, that entire regions of the world had simply stopped being tracked on any map that mattered. She remembered the silence most of all, the way entire streets could sit empty and quiet, as if holding their breath, waiting for the next wave of ships to pass overhead. She had been pulled out of her old unit without much explanation. A colonel named Grace Whitfield had shown up at her camp one evening with a folder marked in red ink and asked her a single question. Did she want to keep fighting a war that could not be won by fighting, or did she want to try something that had never been tried before? Mara had said yes before Whitfield even finished the sentence. The team she joined was small, only 9 people, gathered from different branches of a military that barely functioned as a single force anymore. There was Daniel Ashworth, a quiet young engineer who had once worked designing communication systems before the war began. There was Grace Whitfield herself, who had spent years studying alien technology recovered from crash sites long before most people believed the sovereignty was even real. There was a woman named Priya Kapoor, a linguist who had somehow taught herself to recognize patterns in the sovereignty's communication signals, even without understanding the language itself. And there was Mara, whose job, more than anything else, was to go where the others could not, into damaged ships and abandoned outposts, to bring back pieces of technology that the team could study. Their base was an underground facility, built into the side of a mountain, one of the few places left on Earth that had never been discovered by sovereignty scanners. It had once been a research station for something entirely unrelated to war, built decades earlier, for a purpose nobody now remembered clearly. The walls were lined with old computer terminals, updated as much as possible with whatever equipment the team could gather, and every hour of every day, someone was awake, listening to signals pulled from the sky, trying to understand an enemy that had never once slowed down long enough to be studied properly. For the first several weeks, progress was almost non-existent. The team gathered fragments of destroyed sovereignty ships, small pieces of circuitry, cracked panels covered in symbols nobody could read. Daniel spent long nights trying to reverse the logic of alien wiring, comparing it again and again to human systems, searching for any pattern that might make sense. Priya listened to hours of recorded transmissions, slowly building a rough map of how the sovereignty's language worked, though most of what she learned seemed useless on its own. It was Grace who first noticed something strange in the data. She had been studying recordings taken during 3 separate battles, moments when sovereignty ships suddenly changed direction or altered their formations without any visible reason. At first she assumed it was simply alien tactics, some strategy human forces did not yet understand. But the timing bothered her. Every single time it happened, a specific signal appeared in the background of the recordings, always at the exact same frequency, always originating from the same general direction, no matter where in the world the battle was taking place. She brought the recordings to Mara late one night, the 2 of them sitting alone in the dim light of the underground lab while the rest of the team slept. "Every fleet obeys this signal instantly," Grace said, replaying the recording for the 3rd time. "Watch the formation here. It breaks apart in less than 2 seconds. No ship questions it. No ship hesitates. It's like they're not even making a decision. They're just responding." Mara studied the pattern on the screen, watching the small burst of light representing the signal appear again and again. "You think it's a command frequency," she said slowly, "something that overrides everything else." "I think it's more than that," Grace said. "I think it might be tied to a single source. Watch the strength of the signal. It doesn't weaken or shift the way a normal broadcast would across that distance. It's like it's being generated fresh each time, close to wherever the fighting is happening, rather than transmitted from somewhere far away." It took another 6 weeks of careful, painstaking work, cross-referencing every recorded battle they could find, matching signal patterns against known movements of sovereignty leadership, before the team finally understood what they were looking at. The sovereignty's fleets were not simply well-trained. They were built around a single point of authority, a personal authentication signal generated by whichever high commander was present at any given battle. A signal so trusted by the automated systems built into every ship that it could override standing orders instantly, without question, without delay. It made a strange kind of sense once they understood it. The sovereignty had never lost a war before Earth. Their command structure had never needed to consider what would happen if that trust were ever misplaced. Why would they build in safeguards against betrayal from a source that had never once betrayed them? "If we could capture that signal," Daniel said one evening, staring at the diagrams spread across the lab's main table. "And figure out how to feed it false information. Even for a few seconds, we could make an entire fleet doubt its own orders." "That's not the real problem," Grace said. "The real problem is getting close enough to capture a clean version of that signal in the first place. It has to come from a commander of significant rank, not just any officer. Someone whose authority the ships are built to trust completely." The room fell quiet. Everyone understood what that meant without needing to say it aloud. The only individual in the entire war whose authority no ship would ever question was the Emperor himself. Over the following weeks, the team built a small device, no larger than a deck of cards, capable of listening for that exact signal pattern and storing it long enough to be analyzed, and, if the theory held, altered and rebroadcast. It was untested. There was no way to test it safely, not without access to the very source they needed to study. Daniel worked almost without sleep during the final days, refining the device again and again, aware that if it failed at the moment it mattered most, there would be no second chance. Mara had asked to be the one to carry it. Nobody argued with her. Everyone on the team understood, without needing it explained, that this was not a mission with a clear plan for survival. It was a mission built entirely around a single, narrow opportunity, one that might only ever exist for a few minutes, if it existed at all. "You understand what we're asking," Grace had said to her the night before Mara left the mountain base for the last time. "If this works, it could change everything. If it fails, there's a very real chance you won't be in a position to try again." "I understand," Mara had answered simply. "You don't have to be the one," Grace pressed. "We could still find another way to place the device." Mara had shaken her head. "There isn't going to be another surrender ceremony," she said. "There isn't going to be another moment where the Emperor himself stands close enough, broadcasting his own authority to the entire galaxy at once. If this works at all, it works now, or it never works." Grace had not argued further after that. She simply handed Mara the small device, already fitted into a hidden pocket sewn into the lining of a standard uniform jacket, indistinguishable from any other soldier's clothing. Now, standing in the square with the Emperor's voice echoing across 1,000 broadcasts, Mara understood exactly how much rested on the next few minutes. She was close enough. Voth Kalis was standing only a few steps away, his voice carried by devices glowing on the shoulders of every officer near him, his authority radiating outward in a signal none of them could see, but every ship in his fleet was built to trust completely. She thought, briefly, of Grace and Daniel and Priya, waiting somewhere far away for a signal that might never come. She thought of her brother, kneeling at a checkpoint that had never shown him any mercy. She thought of every soldier behind her in that square, heads bowed, believing this was the end. Voth's voice rose again, declaring some new part of Earth's formal surrender. His words translated instantly into 100 human languages at once, his confidence unshaken, his amusement at the stubborn soldier standing near him, already fading into the background of a much larger performance, meant for two worlds watching at the same time. Mara let her fingers close slowly around the small device hidden inside her jacket, feeling its faint warmth against her palm, and she waited, perfectly still, for the exact moment the signal would be strongest. It did not take long. The signal arrived exactly the way Grace had described it, a faint pulse that the hidden device recognized instantly, humming softly against Mara's palm, like a second heartbeat layered over her own. She kept her expression calm, her shoulders relaxed, her eyes fixed politely, somewhere near the Emperor's shoulder, exactly the posture the guards expected from a prisoner, too tired, or too broken, to cause trouble anymore. Inside her jacket, the device began its work in silence. It did not need long. Daniel had designed it to move quickly, to listen for only a few seconds before beginning the far more delicate task of reshaping what it heard. Mara had no way of knowing, in that moment, whether the device was succeeding or failing. All she could do was stand still, breathe evenly, and trust the work of people she could not see. Voth continued speaking, unaware that anything at all was happening beside him. He gestured broadly toward the kneeling crowd, listing the terms of Earth's surrender in a calm, almost cheerful tone, the kind of voice a person might use while reading a list of minor administrative details. Around him, his officers stood at attention, their armor glowing faintly with the same pale light that marked every ship in the Sovereignty fleet as connected to a single, trusted source of command. It was Thren who noticed first that something was wrong. He had been standing near the ship's ramp, monitoring status reports scrolling silently across a small display built into his wrist, when the numbers in front of him suddenly shifted in a way that made no sense. A formation of support vessels stationed above the city, ships that should have remained in a fixed holding pattern awaiting further orders, had just received a command to begin repositioning. Thren frowned, checking the command's origin, expecting to see his own authorization, or perhaps a routine adjustment issued automatically by the fleet's navigation systems. Instead, the command's origin traced back to the Emperor's own authentication signal. That alone would not normally have troubled him. Voth issued commands constantly, often without explaining his reasoning to anyone. But Thren had not seen the Emperor issue any such order. Voth was standing right there in front of him, speaking to the cameras, his attention entirely on the surrender ceremony below. Thren dismissed the discrepancy for a moment, assuming it was some minor error in the display, a common enough occurrence, given how much strain the fleet's systems had been under during months of continuous warfare. He glanced back toward the sky just in time to see one of the support vessels break formation entirely, drifting sideways in a pattern that did not match any standard maneuver in the fleet's programming. A second later, another ship followed, then a third. Thren's frown deepened into something closer to alarm. He tapped the display on his wrist, pulling up a wider view of the fleet's status across the entire region, and what he saw made his stomach tighten with a feeling he had not experienced in a very long time. Ships stationed above 3 different cities, hundreds of kilometers apart, were all reporting the same strange pattern of contradictory commands, each one traced back to the Emperor's authentication signal, each one arriving within seconds of one another, despite the distances involved. That was not possible, not through any legitimate channel. He moved quickly toward Voth, careful to keep his expression neutral, unwilling to interrupt the Emperor's speech in front of the cameras without absolute certainty that something was truly wrong. He leaned close, speaking in a low voice meant only for Voth's translator to catch. "My Emperor," he murmured, "there is an irregularity in the fleet's command signal. Multiple vessels are receiving orders that did not originate from any authorized channel I can identify." Voth's expression flickered, the first small crack in the calm amusement he had worn since stepping off the ship. He kept speaking to the cameras for another few seconds, finishing his sentence smoothly enough that none of the watching billions noticed anything unusual, before turning his head slightly toward Thren. "Explain," he said quietly, the warmth gone entirely from his voice now. "The commands are tracing back to your own signal," Thren said, "but you have issued no such orders. Someone is broadcasting a version of your authentication that the ships cannot distinguish from the genuine source." For a long moment, Voth said nothing at all. His large, dark eyes moved slowly across the square, across the kneeling crowd, across the rows of his own honor guard standing at perfect attention, before finally settling on the one figure who had refused to kneel from the very beginning. Mara met his gaze without flinching. "Search her," Voth said, his voice suddenly sharp, stripped of every trace of amusement it had carried only minutes earlier. 2 guards moved toward Mara immediately, their hands already reaching for her arms, but it was already too late. The device hidden inside her jacket had finished its work several seconds earlier, releasing a carefully altered version of the captured signal back into the air, a signal built to carry the exact authentication markers the fleet's systems trusted completely, layered now with a cascade of contradictory instructions, designed by Daniel over weeks of careful, desperate calculation. The guards seized Mara's arms, pulling her roughly away from the Emperor, tearing open the lining of her jacket, and finding the small device within seconds. One of them held it up, examining it with confusion, unable to understand what it was, or what it had already done. It did not matter anymore. The signal was already loose, spreading outward across the fleet's communication network at the speed of light, reaching every ship connected to the Sovereignty's command structure, not just above Earth, but across the vast distances linking Earth's occupied skies to relay stations positioned throughout the system, stations built to carry the Emperor's authority instantly to every corner of his empire. Across the city, and then across the world, Sovereignty ships began receiving commands that contradicted one another in ways their systems had never been designed to resolve. Some vessels were ordered to withdraw entirely from their positions. Others were ordered to power down their weapon systems for what the false signal described as a scheduled inspection. Still others received commands instructing them to treat nearby sovereignty vessels as unauthorized intruders, triggering automated defensive protocols that had never once, in the history of the Empire, been used against ships flying under the Emperor's own banner. The ships did not fight back against these commands, because they had never been built to question the source. That had always been the sovereignty's greatest strength, the absolute, unwavering trust every vessel placed in its Emperor's authority. Now, in the span of only a few minutes, that same trust was being turned entirely against them. Voth's own flagship, the massive vessel looming over the square, began flashing warning lights across its outer hull as its internal systems struggled to process a flood of orders that made no coherent sense. Officers inside the ship scrambled between control stations, shouting conflicting reports at one another, trying desperately to determine which commands were genuine and which were not, a task that had never before been necessary and for which none of them had ever trained. Down in the square, Voth's calm composure had completely disappeared. He turned toward Thren, his voice rising in a way none of his officers had ever heard before, sharp and edged with something close to panic. "Shut it down," he snapped. "Cut the authentication relay, now." "My Emperor," Thren said, his own voice tight with barely controlled alarm. "The relay cannot simply be shut down. It would leave the entire fleet without any command authority at all. Every ship would be operating independently, with no way to receive legitimate orders either." "Then find another way," Voth said. "I do not care how. Fix this." Around them, chaos was spreading visibly now, even to the humans still kneeling in the square, who slowly began lifting their heads to watch alien ships drifting erratically overhead, engines flaring unevenly, formations breaking apart in ways that made no sense to anyone watching from below. Somewhere in the distance, a low, rolling sound echoed across the city as two sovereignty vessels, each convinced the other had turned traitor, activated defensive systems against one another for the very first time. Mara, still held firmly by the two guards, watched it all unfold with a strange, quiet calm settling over her, even as her arms were pinned painfully behind her back. She had known, when Grace handed her the device weeks earlier, that there was no way to predict exactly how the sovereignty's systems would respond once the false signal was released. They had built the device based on theory, on careful study, on months of listening to a language of trust they barely understood. There had been no way to test it beforehand, no way to know for certain that it would work at all. Watching the sky above her fill with confusion, watching ships that had once seemed unstoppable now stumble over their own programming, Mara finally allowed herself to believe, just for a moment, that it had worked exactly as Grace and Daniel had hoped. Voth turned back toward her, his composed, mocking expression from earlier completely gone, replaced now by something far more dangerous, something raw and furious, and, underneath it all, unmistakably afraid. "What have you done?" he said, his voice low and shaking with barely restrained anger. Mara held his gaze steadily, despite the guard's grip on her arms, despite the growing chaos spreading across the sky above them. "You told everyone watching that standing here changes nothing," she said quietly. "I wanted to see if that was true." For the first time since he had stepped off his ship, Voth Kalis had no answer ready at all. Above them, across the entire region, alarms continued sounding through the sovereignty fleet, spreading outward faster than any single commander could hope to contain, carrying the confusion of that single square in Earth's ruined capital out across an empire that had never once, in all its long history, been forced to doubt itself from within. Far beneath the surface of the mountain that hid the human resistance base, Grace Whitfield sat perfectly still in front of a bank of monitors, her hands frozen above the console, watching lines of data scroll past faster than she could fully process. Beside her, Daniel Ashworth leaned forward so closely that his breath fogged the edge of one screen, his eyes wide, his lips moving silently as he tried to keep pace with what he was seeing. "It's spreading," Priya Kapoor said from the far end of the room, her voice tight with disbelief. She had been monitoring intercepted sovereignty transmissions for months, growing familiar with the steady, confident rhythm of their communications. What she was hearing now was nothing like that rhythm. Voices overlapped in confusion, commands were repeated and countermanded within seconds of one another, and beneath it all ran a current of something Priya had never once detected in months of listening: uncertainty.
How far?
Grace asked, not taking her eyes off her own screen. Not just Earth's orbit, Priya said. I'm picking up relay confirmations from stations positioned much farther out. If I'm reading this correctly, and I think I am, the signal reached command relays connected to at least 2 other occupied systems within the first 90 seconds. Daniel looked up sharply. 2 other systems, he repeated. That's not supposed to be possible. The relay network wasn't built for real-time transmission across that kind of distance. It wasn't built to be tested this way either, Grace said quietly. We didn't design this to reach beyond Earth's fleet. We only hoped it would work at all. None of them said what they were all thinking, that Mara Ellison had walked directly into the heart of the Sovereignty's command structure, with a plan built on theory and hope, and that whatever was unfolding now, in real time, across a scale none of them had fully anticipated, was happening because of a choice she alone had made, in the final seconds before the device activated. On the other occupied worlds humanity had never even had contact with, worlds whose names existed only in fragments of translated data, the resistance team had managed to piece together over months of study. The effects of the false signal were just beginning to ripple outward, in ways Voth Kalis had never imagined possible. On a planet the Sovereignty had conquered nearly 2 decades earlier, a world called Corvain by its original inhabitants before the Empire renamed it. An occupying garrison stationed above the planet's largest remaining settlement suddenly found its automated defense systems responding to commands that made no sense. Ships that had held a steady, unbroken orbit for years without incident began drifting out of position. Ground forces stationed in the settlement, expecting routine patrol orders, instead received instructions ordering an immediate and unexplained withdrawal from key positions throughout the city. The Corvanian resistance, a scattered, poorly equipped network of survivors who had spent years attempting small, quiet acts of sabotage with little real effect, watched in stunned confusion as Sovereignty patrols suddenly abandoned checkpoints they had held without interruption for years. It took them only a few minutes to understand that something extraordinary was happening, something far beyond anything their own efforts could have caused. Word spread quickly, the way it always does when the impossible suddenly seems within reach. Within the hour, small groups that had never dared to act openly began moving through abandoned checkpoints, reclaiming ground that had been lost for nearly 2 decades, driven not by any coordinated plan, but by the simple, electrifying realization that the Empire's grip, the grip that had always seemed absolute and unshakable, was for the first time visibly, undeniably uncertain. On a second occupied world, one the Sovereignty had claimed only 3 years earlier, a world still recovering from the devastation of its own conquest, similar confusion spread through the occupying forces stationed there. Officers who had grown used to unquestioning obedience from their fleet found themselves suddenly unable to distinguish legitimate commands from the chaos rippling outward from Earth's captured surrender broadcast, a broadcast that, ironically, had been intended to demonstrate the absolute, unbreakable authority of the Empire to every world watching. Instead, that same broadcast, still playing across screens throughout the Sovereignty's territory, now showed something entirely different. It showed an emperor whose calm, mocking confidence had visibly cracked. It showed alien officers scrambling in open confusion, their carefully maintained composure completely abandoned. It showed, for every world watching, the first undeniable proof that the Sovereignty's power was not, in fact, absolute. Back in the square, the chaos above the city continued to build with no sign of slowing. Voth stood rigid, his robe no longer trailing gracefully behind him, but instead bunched awkwardly where he had gripped it in one clenched fist, listening to a rapid stream of reports arriving through Thren's increasingly desperate translations. 3 vessels above the northern district have engaged one another directly, Thren reported, his voice strained. Ground forces at 2 garrison points have received withdrawal orders and are already abandoning their positions. My Emperor, I am receiving similar reports now from outside this system entirely. Voth's head snapped toward him. That is impossible, he said. The relay was never intended to reach beyond a single system's command structure. It was not intended to, Thren agreed grimly, but it is happening regardless. I believe whatever was used to generate the false signal did not simply mimic your authority for local ships. It appears to have been layered directly into the authentication protocol at its source, allowing it to propagate through every connected relay exactly as a genuine command from you would. For a long, heavy moment, Voth said nothing at all. He looked out across the square, past the kneeling crowd, past his own scrambling officers, toward the sky where two of his own ships continued exchanging fire in confused, uncoordinated bursts, each one still convinced the other had somehow betrayed the Empire. He turned back to Mara, still restrained by his guards, her expression calm despite the chaos surrounding her. "You could not have known this would happen," he said, his voice quieter now, almost disbelieving. No single device could account for something on this scale. "We didn't know," Mara admitted honestly. "We only knew what your systems trusted, and we knew you had never once needed to consider what would happen if that trust was misplaced. Everything else was always going to happen the moment it started, whether we predicted it or not." Voth's expression shifted again, the fury draining slowly into something far more complicated, something closer to the particular kind of fear that comes only from realizing a mistake too large to ever fully undo. He had spent his entire reign building an empire on the certainty that no one, anywhere, could ever challenge the absolute trust his ships placed in him. He had never once considered that the very foundation of his power might also be its single greatest weakness. Thren approached again, his voice lower now, urgent. "My Emperor, the fleet's automated defense protocols are beginning to interpret the ongoing confusion as evidence of a coordinated uprising. Several vessels have begun preparing to retreat entirely from contested positions, rather than risk further unauthorized engagement. If this continues unchecked, we risk losing operational control not just here, but across multiple systems simultaneously." "Then regain control," Voth snapped, though the sharpness in his voice now carried more desperation than command. "There is no clear way to do that quickly," Thren admitted. "Re-establishing trusted authentication across every affected relay would take considerable time we do not currently have, while the confusion continues to spread. And every additional minute this continues, more worlds are watching a broadcast that shows the Empire unable to control even its own fleet." Voth turned slowly, looking once more at the crowd of kneeling humans, many of whom had lifted their heads entirely now, watching the sky above them, with expressions shifting rapidly from despair to something else entirely, something cautious and disbelieving, and, in a few scattered faces near the front of the crowd, unmistakably hopeful. He looked, finally, back at Mara Ellison, the single soldier who had refused to kneel, who had stood silently through his mockery, who had carried within the lining of her uniform the one thing his empire had never prepared for, the possibility of betrayal from within its own foundation. "What do you want?" he said quietly, the words clearly costing him something enormous to speak aloud. "Name it. Whatever will make this stop." Mara studied him for a long moment before answering, aware that every word she spoke now was being broadcast to two worlds at once, aware that whatever she said next would be remembered far longer than anything that had happened in that square before the signal was released. "I don't have the power to make it stop," she said finally. "I never did. All I did was give your own ships a reason to stop trusting you completely. What happens next isn't something I control anymore. It's something your empire has to answer for itself." Above them, the chaos continued to spread, unhurried and unstoppable, carrying the truth of that single moment outward across every world the sovereignty had ever claimed to rule absolutely. By the time the sun began sinking toward the horizon over the ruined city, the square that had been arranged for a surrender ceremony looked nothing like the scene of quiet, total defeat it had been only hours earlier. The kneeling crowd had long since risen to their feet, no longer held in place by fear alone, but by a cautious, disbelieving curiosity as they watched sovereignty officers moving in tight, anxious clusters, speaking rapidly into devices that no longer seemed to offer them the certainty they once had. Inside the flagship looming above the square, Voth Kalis sat alone in a private chamber, having finally stepped away from the chaos below to receive a growing stream of reports from across his empire. None of them brought good news. On Corvain, the resistance had reclaimed nearly a third of the settlement his forces had held for 2 decades, and the garrison stationed there, unable to distinguish legitimate orders from the ongoing confusion in the relay network, had made the decision to withdraw entirely, rather than risk further unauthorized conflict among its own ranks. On the world claimed only 3 years earlier, similar reports were arriving of open unrest spreading through settlements that had, until that morning, shown no sign of organized resistance at all. Worse than any single report was the pattern forming across all of them. Every world watching the broadcast from Earth, every screen displaying the moment Voth's own authority had been turned against itself, was drawing the same conclusion at once. If the Emperor's own trusted signal could be captured and used against his fleet by a single soldier on a planet already presumed defeated, then perhaps the Empire's absolute control had never been as unshakable as it always claimed to be. Thren entered the chamber quietly, waiting near the doorway until Voth acknowledged him with a tired, weary glance. "The Council has convened remotely," Thren said carefully. "They are requesting your immediate presence to discuss the situation." Voth let out a slow breath. The Council rarely convened without direct summons from the Emperor himself. That they had done so now, on their own initiative, told him everything he needed to know about how seriously they viewed what was unfolding. The conversation that followed, broadcast only within the highest levels of sovereignty leadership rather than to the watching worlds below, was unlike any Voth had ever participated in during his long reign. Counselors who had always deferred entirely to his judgment now spoke with unusual directness, laying out in blunt terms the scale of what had already been lost, and the far greater losses that remained possible if the unrest continued to spread unchecked. Re-establishing full authentication across the relay network will take weeks, perhaps longer, one counselor explained, her voice carrying clearly despite the distance separating her from Voth's chamber. During that time, every occupied world will remain vulnerable to further uprisings, inspired by what they have already seen broadcast from Earth. We cannot fight simultaneous unrest across multiple systems, while also attempting to rebuild trust within our own command structure. Then what do you suggest? Voth said, his voice flat, stripped of the confidence that had defined every public appearance he had ever made. We suggest containment, another counselor answered. Immediate, visible action that demonstrates control has been restored, even if that control looks different than what we intended when this campaign began. The situation on Earth in particular must be resolved swiftly and publicly, in a way that reassures the rest of the Empire, rather than continuing to feed the unrest already spreading. Voth understood exactly what they were suggesting, even before the words were spoken plainly. They wanted him to end Earth's occupation, not through further conquest, but through a visible, negotiated resolution, something that could be presented across the Empire as a controlled decision, rather than what it truly was, an admission that the Emperor's authority, once considered absolute, had been successfully challenged by a single, unarmed soldier standing quietly in a square. "You are asking me to negotiate," Voth said slowly, "with a planet I had already declared defeated this very morning. We are asking you to prevent this from becoming far worse than it already is," the first counselor said. "Every hour this continues unresolved, we risk losing more than one planet's occupation. We risk the perception that our entire empire can be undone by anyone clever enough to exploit the same vulnerability. That perception, once it spreads fully, cannot easily be undone." Voth sat in silence for a long moment after the council's transmission ended, alone once more in his private chamber, staring out through a narrow viewport at the city below, where the last light of Earth's sun was fading slowly into evening. He thought of Mara Ellison standing perfectly still while he mocked her in front of two worlds, refusing to give him even the smallest reaction he had expected. He thought of the calm, steady way she had answered him afterward, admitting openly that she had never controlled what would happen once the signal was released, that the chaos spreading now across his empire was simply the truth of his own foundation being tested for the very first time. He had ruled for longer than most humans could imagine living, had conquered 11 worlds without ever once believing any of them capable of truly threatening his authority. And yet here he sat, forced to consider the very real possibility that everything he had built could unravel entirely, not through military defeat, but through a single, quiet demonstration that his empire's trust in itself had never been as absolute as it claimed. When he finally returned to the square, the crowd below had grown larger, drawn by news spreading quickly through whatever communication remained functional across the city. Human soldiers stood mixed among civilians now, no longer separated into neat, defeated rows, watching the alien ships above with expressions no longer defined solely by fear. Voth walked slowly down the ramp once more, though this time his posture carried none of the easy, amused confidence it had held that morning. He stopped in front of Mara, who remained standing exactly where she had been left, no longer restrained, the guards who had held her arms having quietly released her sometime during the hours of chaos above. "I have spoken with my council," Voth said, his voice carrying clearly across the square, picked up once more by the hovering cameras that had never stopped broadcasting throughout the entire ordeal. "The situation across my empire has become complicated in ways that require a different resolution than the one I intended this morning." He paused, and for the first time since stepping off his ship, something in his expression looked almost human in its discomfort, the particular unease of a person forced to say words he had never once imagined needing to speak aloud. "I am prepared to discuss terms," he said finally, "for the withdrawal of sovereignty forces from Earth, and for a formal ceasefire to be observed, while broader arrangements are negotiated." A wave of stunned silence moved through the crowd, followed almost immediately by a low, disbelieving murmur that grew steadily louder as the words settled fully into the minds of everyone listening. Soldiers who had knelt that morning, certain they were witnessing the final moments of humanity's freedom, now stood in confused, cautious hope, watching an alien emperor speak words none of them had believed they would ever hear. Mara studied Voth for a long moment before responding, aware that whatever she said next would be remembered as clearly as anything spoken in that square all day. "You said this morning that standing here changes nothing," she said quietly. "I think you understand now that isn't true." Voth held her gaze, and for the first time, he did not attempt to hide the honest weight of what he was feeling. "I underestimated what a single choice could set in motion," he admitted. "I will not make that mistake again." The negotiations that followed over the coming weeks were neither simple nor complete. Earth's leadership, scattered and battered after 11 months of war, worked carefully alongside representatives from the Sovereignty's Council to establish terms that would end active conflict, while addressing the far larger question of what recovery would look like for a planet that had lost so much. It was not a perfect peace. Deep wounds remained on both sides, and trust, once broken so thoroughly, would take far longer than a single afternoon to rebuild. But across the Sovereignty's 11 worlds, something had shifted permanently the moment that broadcast played out from Earth's ruined capital. On Corvain, the resistance that had reclaimed a third of their settlement refused to relinquish the ground they had taken, forcing the Empire into its own separate negotiations there as well. On the world conquered only 3 years earlier, unrest continued simmering in ways the Sovereignty could no longer simply suppress, through overwhelming force alone, not without risking further unrest spreading elsewhere. Grace Whitfield, Daniel Ashworth, and Priya Kapoor emerged from their mountain base weeks later, blinking in unfamiliar sunlight, greeted not as the quiet, unnoticed team they had always been, but as the architects of a discovery that had reshaped the balance of an entire war. None of them sought recognition for it. They understood, better than most, that the true turning point had not been the device itself, careful and clever as its design had been, but the choice made by one soldier to stand exactly where she needed to be, at exactly the moment it mattered most. Mara Ellison returned, eventually, to an ordinary life that felt almost strange after everything that had happened, though she rarely spoke publicly about the details of that day in the square. When people asked her, occasionally, what had gone through her mind while an alien emperor mocked her in front of 2 worlds, she would usually offer only a small, quiet smile before answering. "I decided a long time ago," she would say, "that I'd rather lose everything standing up than keep anything at all by kneeling." It was not a complete victory. Wars rarely end that cleanly, and the peace that followed carried its own long, difficult road ahead. But in a square that had once been prepared for humanity's final, unconditional surrender, a single choice made by one soldier had proven, in the span of only a few minutes, that even the most absolute power in the galaxy could be forced to answer for the trust it had never once thought to question. And somewhere far above Earth, drifting quietly among the stars that had once seemed to belong entirely to an empire without limits. The first fragile terms of a fragile peace began, slowly, to take shape.